Hi everyone, I'm Brandon Keim, and my research is on the various systems of parole and probation, and which one is the most effective. So parole and probation, for those of you who don't know what it is both a form of punishment. Typically with probation, you'll get probation instead of a jail sentence, or you could get released from jail earlier. And it is a way to get released from prison or incarceration earlier, typically in the form of parole. You will get released earlier from your sentence from prison. Uh, the systems of parole and probation vary from state to state, both in how the programs are run and the severity of how they treat the clients, and that is in terms of the intensity, and that's what I'll be looking at. I'll be comparing, I did research on the forms of intensive supervision, which several states use, versus what's known as probation or parole as usual. So I will be examining the effectiveness of the parole and probation programs of various states and the individual's successful reentry into society or their recidivism to provide support for which type of system is the best. So the first state we'll be looking at is Hawaii. Hawaii was the first state to institute a form of intensive probation, and it's called the HOPE program, which is Hawaii's Opportunity Probation Enforcement Program. So according to an article, the HOPE program is not, it's intense, its intensity is, it's an intense supervision, but it's probationer centered. So what they want to do is take all of the people in the criminal justice system who a probationer might come into contact with, from the officers to correction staff, lawyers, the judges, to all come together to help change and help the probationers. So to do this, they use intensive supervision through the use of sanctions. So under the HOPE program, they increase the amounts of drug tests, mandatory jail time, warrants. So with drug tests, under what's known as probation as usual, they often will let the probationer know up to a month in advance the date of their drug test. Under Hawaii's HOPE program, the clients were given a color, and they would have to call every morning and see if their color was chosen. If it was, they would have until 2 p.m. to go into their probationer's office to take a drug test. If they didn't go in, an immediate warrant would be issued, and they would have to spend at minimum 72 hours in jail as a sanction. So the main goal of the HOPE program is to reduce jail time that they'll serve, to reduce drug use. So mandatory jail time is another thing. So what probationers on probation and parolees on parole have conditions to their release. They have to follow certain rules, and that can be no drug use, no cohabiting with other criminals, no alcohol use. A lot of it depends on the crime that they were convicted of. So, and if you violate a condition, it's a sanction. So the sanctions, like I said, for HOPE program include mandatory jail time, warrants. Under probation as usual, typically the system doesn't move fast, so it's not what's known as swift and certain. And some of the results of the HOPE program included probationers were 55% less likely to be arrested for new crimes, 72% less likely to use drugs, and that was tested through drug tests, 61% less likely to skip appointments, 53% less likely to have their probation revoked, and that's according to a Pew poll. This is, again, the HOPE program's main goals are to ensure that people don't go back to jail and to reduce drug use. And so the system of the colors for the drug tests, for example, a newer probationer just out of jail will have a color that is called more frequently than someone who has successfully tested negative continuously for weeks, and they've been in the program potentially for a couple months. They'll have a color that is called less often. So it's a random assignment, but they do have colors that are drawn more. And so when the probationer or the parolee doesn't know when they might be called for a drug test, and when they are called for one, they have to show up that day. There's no week or month advance notice. They know that they shouldn't be using drugs, and that leads to the 72% decrease in drug use among the participants of the HOPE program. Also, 20% of the participants are less likely to be confined due to a sanction, and those who were sanctioned spent on average 16 fewer days incarcerated than a typical probationer in a normal probation as usual program. So Hawaii was one of the first states that enacted this type of intensive supervision. More states followed it and modeled it based off the HOPE program. The next one is Washington, which is called the WISP program, Washington Intensive Supervision Program, which is also a swift and certain model based off HOPE. Examples of intensity they align pretty similarly with Hawaii. So increased drug tests, random drug tests, and immediate sanctions. So they don't use a color system, they just randomly call their clients and expect them to be there. And the swift and certain aspect is that for drug tests, for example, they're called and they have to be there that day. If they don't, a warrant is issued immediately. So that's one of the things that makes it more intense. And so with the Washington program, the participants were 20% less likely to be convicted of a new crime during and after their probation term, and 30% less likely to be convicted of a felony. And overall, there was a 10% reduction in crime while the WISP participants were receiving treatment. That was a part that the Washington program focused on more than the Hawaii HOPE program, was treatment for drug offenses, alcohol abusers, and then also mental health treatment for those who need it. The next state that also modeled off of the HOPE model and the swift and certain model was Michigan, with their Michigan's Swift and Sure Sanctions program, a probation program. So the Michigan program, they wanted to ensure that all violations are punished and sanctions are given within 72 hours of the violation. So typically, upon the officer finding out that a violation happens, a bench warrant will be issued immediately for the arrest, and then they're brought to the judge. So Michigan also follows the system like Hawaii, which encompasses, they like to include everyone, the judge, the officers, the lawyers, everyone who's in the system and who the probationer will have contact with, to productively work on solutions together. And so that's why the judges are quick to issue warrants and they're quick to be brought before the judge, because this is the main point, as stated by Elm, the person who started the HOPE program in Hawaii, is to rehabilitate the probationers, not just punish them for violating their conditions, but to overall rehabilitate them. So in Michigan, individuals were 36% usual participants. I had technical difficulties. Yeah, so 36% were less likely to reoffend compared to the probation as usual, and 13.7% received sanctions compared to 21.6% of the probation as usual participants. And that is due, again, to the knowledge that they will be punished when they're caught. It's swift, it's certain punishments. They'll spend at least 3 days in jail at a minimum for their punishment. And for people who work, for example, they will, it's all about rehabilitation for the probationers and the offenders. So people who are employed, they'll put their jail sentence on the weekend so that they can keep their job and they can continue to reconnect with society and to be contributing members to society. And another program that we looked at was Texas's SWIFT program, which is supervision with intensive enforcement. And so it was somewhat based off the Hope model, but it is a sanctions court. So the judges what they did in Texas, they hired 2 judges who were they were picked by the county elected officials, and they had to be all about helping the probationers who were in this program. So SWIFT required the full commitment of the offenders. If they messed up at all, they'd be revoked, and being revoked is sent back to jail or prison. And again, they were swift and certain. So they required the offenders to want to seek rehabilitation. It was a program that the offenders had to want to be in. They didn't just get it based off being high risk. And so it requires rehabilitation as part of their conditions. Again, drug programs, alcohol programs, mental health programs. And so by making them want to be there, it really encouraged them to do better than those on standard probation. So overall, they were revoked less than probation as usual individuals. So a study done by Snell compared SWIFT participants versus probation as usual participants and how they were revoked. And you would get revoked by committing a new crime or seriously violating your conditions. So in the first 6 months that they were looked at, 22 SWIFT participants were revoked versus 81 probation as usual participants who were revoked. And then after 1 year, 54 SWIFT clients were revoked versus 161 standard probation people who were revoked. And SWIFT also incorporated rewards for good behavior and following their conditions. And that included reduced community service hours, lower fines, lower fees for probation, because probationers have to pay fees to be supervised. But they were also just as quick to give jail sanctions for violations. And overall, 19.72% reduction in violations of conditions among the SWIFT participants, and a 23.52% reduction in positive drug tests. So then I also had to look at probation as usual, who it worked best for. And so probation as usual, which is just standard probation, like I mentioned earlier, some of the things that make it different from intense supervision is the individuals, they might be told by their officer a month in advance that they're going to have a drug test, or if they violate a condition, unlike the SWIFT and certain programs, which will punish you within 72 hours and you'll have to spend a jail sentence. So instead of doing that, they might get a verbal warning from their probation officer. They might just get an extra fine, or they might have to do more community service hours. And that's a difference of jail sanctions versus community sanctions. Community sanctions include more community service, more fees, include you might have to put on a electronic monitor to stay at your house arrest, but rather than jail sanctions, which is what SWIFT and certain programs focus on. So from all the research, probation as usual, standard probation, works best for low-risk offenders, which are first-time offenders, individuals who maybe they had a DUI, made a mistake, but they still have a career, they still have a family, so they're low risk. That's what probation as usual is best for. They don't require as intense supervision or as often supervision. So with intense supervision, you might have to meet with your probation officer weekly, as what happens with Washington WISP program. Starting, you have to meet with your parole or probation officer weekly. With probation as usual, you might not have to meet with a probation officer at all, which is a bench probation. You don't have to meet with them at all. You basically supervise yourself, but you still have conditions. But yeah, so a part of the probation as usual is sporadic sanctions. So they're not sanctioned swiftly. They're not, definitely, it's not certain. And there will be delays. So for example, if someone violates a condition, it might take a week or a month for them to receive their sanction, if it is jail. But also another aspect is with the SWIFT and certain programs, they receive their jail sanctions, but it might be for 2 days, 3 days, just maybe a week. Typically, overall, with probation as usual, although it might take a month to be sent to jail, typically the sanctions are longer, so you might be in there for a month. So it's not beneficial for everyone, but it does work for some. So some of after the research, my policy implications that I would recommend based on the research is, so right now, currently, the states aren't uniform in how they run their supervision systems. So like Hawaii, Michigan, Washington, Texas, Alaska, Kentucky, they all have intense supervision programs. Other states don't. So one of my policy implications would be to each state, not at the federal level, but for each state individually, to create and enact intense supervision programs following the HOPE Hawaii model that is based on rehabilitation and actually wanting the probationers to get better. But also, since the intense supervision doesn't work best for everyone, to create a risk index or a risk system, an index, a matrix to classify those as high risk or low risk to best place them in their programs. So for example, Washington with the WISP program, they had 66,000 individuals on supervision. Once they created their intense supervision, they dropped it down to 16,000 intensely supervised, and the other 50,000 were low supervision. So it reshaped manpower to allow for the intense supervision of those who need it, the high-risk individuals, and for the low-risk individuals to who don't need much supervision. So it effectively managed manpower and caseloads and casework. And also, according to another study, those who are on parole and probation, it was a study that analyzed over 3 years those on parole and probation and their recidivism rates. So what it found was those who are on parole for at least 3 years offend or recidivize less than those who are on parole for a term shorter than, so for example, 2 years. And then they looked at both individuals, those who had been on parole for 3 years and those for 2 years, and it continued watching them to see how often they reoffended or recommitted a new crime. And those who served at least 3 years of parole or probation or supervision, they reoffended less than those who served a shorter supervision term. So another policy implication would be to extend the timelines of supervision, so that, but most importantly for the high-risk individuals. And so some of the strengths, I did strengths and weaknesses for my study. Strengths included solid results for the participating states that enacted these intensive supervision programs, and the results among the states that did them, so Hawaii, Washington, Michigan, Texas, they saw similar results. But what I found as a possible weakness is geographically, only a handful of states have enacted it. So what works in Hawaii or Washington state might not work in California or Nevada or Florida or New York. And also definitions aren't universal. And by that, I mean what one's program might classify as high risk, another might not. So the terms that are used could affect the results. And what one program considers reoffending, some might consider just violating a condition as a reoffending, some might not. So those are some of the weaknesses, and these are my references. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.